The broadcast cut in without warning. A calm male voice announced, "Singer Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead on arrival at," and the rest blurred together. For a split second, Smokey Robinson reportedly sat there thinking, "This has to be a cruel April Fool's joke. This can't be real." But it was. And for many who grew up inside that same world of Motown brilliance and quiet catastrophe, it became a symbol of something deeper. The way the industry dealt with anything that might ruin the illusion. There were 5 legendary black R&B women who walked onto stages in sequined gowns, smiling under hot spotlights while crowds screamed their names. To the world, they were untouchable icons. Behind closed doors, according to countless whispers and hushed recollections, their lives were quietly collapsing because the system around them had already decided one thing: visible motherhood, the kind that complicated fantasy, would cost too much. This documentary follows one of the darkest sets of rumors ever attached to Motown's golden era, tracing it through the gaps in Smokey Robinson's stories, the things he said, and the things he notably never fully denied. It moves through reports of secret pregnancies, children born far from the cameras, and private agreements that were believed to exist for one purpose only: to erase those children from the public record before they could change the story. Tours went on, box offices filled, and records climbed the charts. The headlines stayed clean. Inside that silence, careers were carefully shielded. And the women at the center of it all were expected to smile, sing, and perform perfection, while the most human parts of their lives were locked away where no one was supposed to look. These children, according to those who later spoke in fragments, were not hidden because their mothers were ashamed of them. They were hidden out of fear of contracts, of executives, of clauses buried in fine print, and of an industry that saw women first as images, then as assets, rarely as mothers. What follows is not presented as gossip, but as a reconstruction of how 5 R&B legends appeared to slowly break under a weight they were never allowed to name. Chapter 1. Aretha Franklin, the children born in absolute silence, 1955. 1957. Before the world called her the Queen of Soul, before the award shows and the thunderous standing ovations, there was a young girl named Aretha Franklin standing inside a structure that had already drawn up her future. She was not yet a woman, not yet a legend, and, in many ways, not yet permitted to be fully human. What happened between 1955 and 1957 would be pushed so far into the shadows that even decades later, the truth surfaced only in fragments, half-remembered comments, carefully phrased acknowledgments, and lines in biographies that said just enough without ever saying too much. On the 28th of January 1955, in Memphis, Tennessee, Aretha Louise Franklin gave birth to her first son, Clarence Franklin. She was 12 years old. There were no glossy magazine announcements, no newspaper columns, no radio chatter. In an America that fed on scandal and moral outrage, this story did not appear in the headlines not because it lacked shock value, but because, according to multiple accounts, powerful hands made certain it never did. Aretha was already known in church circles as a gospel prodigy, the gifted daughter of Reverend C. L. Franklin, a charismatic preacher whose pulpit drew politicians, celebrities, and civil rights leaders. The Franklin name carried weight. The church carried influence. Together, they created a shield that, according to later recollections, did not offer comfort so much as control. Protect the image, protect the ministry, protect the brand. The identity of Clarence's father was never publicly confirmed. Officially, it remains undocumented. Within the walls of the Franklin home and the church community, the message, as relatives and associates would later suggest, was unmistakable. This was not a story for the outside world. It was said that reporters who grew too curious were quietly redirected. Members of the congregation were believed to have been instructed not to gossip. Some family members later claimed they were told, in no uncertain terms, never to ask questions. Aretha went back to singing as if nothing had changed, not because she had healed, but because she was never really given a choice to stop. Then, history repeated itself. On the 31st of August 1957, at just 14 years old, Aretha gave birth to her second son, Edward Franklin. Once again, there were no headlines, no interviews, no official explanations. 2 pregnancies before the age of 15 should have sent shockwaves through the country. Instead, they barely caused a ripple beyond the people forced to manage them. The church, according to those who later spoke about the era, framed it as a private family matter. The emerging music world around Aretha treated her less as a child in crisis and more as a rising investment that could not be risked. The work came first. The image came first. Everything else could be buried. Behind closed doors, the pressure was unrelenting. Religion, in that context, did not function as refuge. It functioned as discipline. In gospel culture at the time, teenage pregnancy was rarely discussed with therapy or compassion. More often, it was met with a wall of silence, an expectation of quiet repentance, and a demand to carry on as if nothing had happened. Aretha was expected to move forward, to sing harder, to appear stronger. Her fear, confusion, and grief had no public language, not because they weren't real, but because acknowledging them would have meant admitting that the system around her had failed a child. As the years moved on, Aretha's career gathered speed. By the early 1960 seconds, she was recording professionally, traveling, and stepping into the world that would eventually immortalize her voice. But the silence of those early years walked beside her. Clarence and Edward were raised largely away from the public eye, mentioned vaguely if at all. Early profiles and official narratives, according to biographers, often sidestep the fact that the Queen of Soul had become a mother twice while she herself was still just a girl. What makes this chapter especially chilling is not only what was hidden, but how long the silence held. For decades, interviews centered on Aretha's strength, her command, her seemingly unshakable presence. Few asked what it had cost her to become that strong. On the rare occasions when someone approached the subject, the questions were gently deflected, redirected, or shut down. The fathers of her first 2 children were never named publicly. The circumstances around those pregnancies were never laid out in full. The silence, according to those who watched the industry's inner workings, was not random. It was policy. Smokey Robinson, who rose in the same Detroit musical ecosystem, would later speak in general terms about the kind of secrets that lived behind the music. In one reflection, he was quoted as saying, "There are secrets that aren't buried because they're shameful, but because revealing them too soon would destroy a genius before the world ever gets to hear them." He did not name Aretha. He didn't have to. For many insiders, it was clear which stories seemed to fit those words. Aretha Franklin was never granted the space to publicly mourn the childhood she lost. She was not encouraged to say, "I was terrified," or to ask, "Why didn't anyone protect me?" Instead, she was pushed forward, carrying at once the weight of motherhood, trauma, faith, and rising fame. The irony is almost unbearable. Aretha became a global symbol of female strength and emotional honesty in music. Audiences clung to her songs about pain, longing, and survival. Yet the earliest sources of that pain were kept deliberately out of view. The voice that demanded respect for women belonged to someone who, as a child, had not been respected enough to be shielded from harm. Even in later years, when portions of the story became more widely known, they were handled cautiously, almost tenderly, as if the truth itself might still cause damage. But the harm had already been inflicted decades earlier, not on the industry, not on the church, but on a girl who was told to be silent twice before she was old enough to understand what that silence would cost her. This is not a chapter about scandal. It is a chapter about control, about a system that guarded its image more fiercely than it guarded its children, about a voice the world needed, but only on terms the machine could manage. And as this investigation moves forward, one question hangs heavily in the air. If this could happen to Aretha Franklin, hidden in plain sight, shielded by faith and fame, how many other women were pushed into the same enforced silence? Because Aretha Franklin was not allowed to suffer publicly, and that enforced quiet became the first wound that never fully healed. Diana Ross, the marriage suspected to be a media shield, 1969. 1971. When Diana Ross stepped away from the Supremes in 1969, the official story read like a script for destiny. Press releases spoke of evolution, of a natural transition from girl group stardom to solo royalty. Interviews framed it as empowerment, a woman claiming her own stage at last. Cameramen caught her gliding across floors in perfect gowns, smiling with the calm certainty of someone whose future had already been arranged. But according to people who later described what was happening behind closed doors, it was less a coronation and more the opening move in a crisis. Motown could not afford to let the public see. By the end of 1969, Diana Ross was no longer just a singer on the roster. She was Motown's future, a living logo, the label's most profitable image, and, at the same time, its most delicate asset. Every photograph, every television spot, every note she sang had been folded into a long-term plan. In the background, her deeply personal relationship with Berry Gordy, Motown's founder, was reportedly beginning to fracture. What had once been an electric bond, romantic, professional, and intensely intertwined, was, according to longtime observers, splintering under pressure. This was not a quiet mutual parting. It was said to have come apart under secrecy, fear of exposure, and the constant calculation of what could and could not be allowed to reach the outside world. Then came 1970, a year that was presented publicly as a continuation of triumph, but felt, to those on the inside, more like controlled turbulence. Those close to the label later whispered that Diana's personal life was becoming harder to manage from an image standpoint. The relationship with Gordy, while never openly acknowledged in mainstream media at the time, had become an open secret inside Motown's inner circle. Executives knew about it, musicians sensed it. Assistants saw the tension in dressing rooms and offices, yet none of that leaked into the story the public was consuming. On television and in magazines, Diana Ross appeared untouched by chaos, poised, immaculate, and entirely under control. And then, very suddenly, everything sped up. In January 1971, Diana Ross announced her marriage to Robert Ellis Silberstein, a music executive relatively unknown to the average fan. There had been no long public romance, no gradual buildup of tabloid photos or speculative columns. One day she was unfailingly single in the eyes of the press. The next, she was a married woman. The union arrived looking airtight and ready-made. Inside Motown, the reaction was different. Whispers intensified. Some employees would later claim that the wedding felt less like a love story and more like a solution, an answer to a problem that could not be named on paper. According to those accounts, the marriage functioned as a shield, a polished narrative that could stand between Diana Ross and any questions that might threaten her carefully curated image. The rumor that would cling to this marriage for decades was simple, explosive, and never officially confirmed: that Diana Ross was already pregnant before the wedding took place. Those who believed this argued that the timing was too precise to be coincidence, that the ceremony provided a clean explanation before the press could ask the wrong questions. No documents were produced to address those suspicions. No statements were issued to confirm or deny the timeline. Silence did the work by itself. Later that same year, on the 14th of August 1971, Diana gave birth to a daughter, Rhonda Suzanne Silberstein. The public story was neat and orderly. Robert Silberstein was named as her father. Photographs showed a young family. Headlines moved on. The industry exhaled and returned its focus to chart positions and box office numbers. But inside Motown's tight circles, many believed the truth was far more complicated. Years later, Berry Gordy himself would acknowledge that he was in fact Rhonda's biological father. That quiet admission, arriving long after the most fragile years had passed, retroactively reframed the entire sequence of events. Suddenly, what had once been viewed as a simple love and marriage narrative now looked, to some, like a carefully managed cover. The timing of that acknowledgement mattered. It came after contracts had run their course, after hierarchies had shifted, after reputations had hardened into legend. At the time of Rhonda's birth, Berry Gordy did not step forward publicly to claim her. Diana Ross did not challenge the official narrative. The marriage contract stood, the illusion held. According to those who watched Motown's rise from the inside, that silence was not random. It was a tactic. Smokey Robinson, who had a clear view of the label's machinery without being entirely crushed by it, would later offer a line many connected to situations like this. Not every wedding begins with love. He did not name Diana Ross. He didn't have to. For those who knew the history, the implication hung quietly in the air. In Motown, a marriage could be many things. It could be genuine commitment. It could also be protection, camouflage, or damage control masquerading as romance. It could redirect questions before they were ever asked. What makes this chapter especially painful is not just the business strategy, but the emotional cost in the background. According to later interviews and biographies, Diana Ross struggled privately during these years. She was closing one of the most defining relationships of her life, stepping into the suffocating expectations of solo superstardom and preparing for motherhood, all while being required to project flawless composure. The audience saw the gowns, the award shows, the chart-topping singles. They saw the camera-ready smile, the controlled voice, the body that always seemed to move exactly as the moment demanded. What they did not see was the fear that one misstep, one careless answer, one unplanned photograph could unravel everything the machine had built around her. For years, Rhonda grew up believing Robert Silverstein was her biological father. Berry Gordy's role remained unspoken even within close family circles. It was only when Rhonda was an adult that the truth was finally revealed to her. By then, the crucial decisions had long since been made. The emotional impact had already settled in. The damage, if that is what it was, had been absorbed quietly, just as a system like Motown's was designed to ensure. This is what the machine looked like when it was functioning exactly as intended. Problems were not discussed head-on. They were contained and redirected. Image took priority. Truth could wait, if it ever arrived at all. Diana Ross did not go on television in 1971 to argue with rumors. She did not hold press conferences to unpack her private life in real time. That silence, as many have pointed out, should not automatically be read as guilt or deception. Inside Motown's universe, silence was often the only real option. Speaking out could mean losing contracts, losing protection, even losing the legacy that had just begun to form. So, like many women before and after her, Diana carried the weight quietly while the machine continued rolling forward. By the time the public learned the fuller story years later that the affair with Berry Gordy had indeed existed, that Rhonda's true paternity lay with him, the emotional calculus behind that 1,971 wedding still hadn't been fully explored in the mainstream. The real-time pressure, the frantic conversations, the nights of fear between 1,969 and 1,971 remained largely undocumented, frozen in a narrow slice of time where decisions were made quickly, in private, under extreme strain. This chapter is not about proving one rumor definitively right or wrong. It is about examining how power functioned, how narratives were manufactured, and how women at the center of fame were often given a brutally simple choice: comply or risk collapse. Diana Ross survived that window. Her career soared. Her legend only grew stronger. But somewhere behind the platinum records and bright lights, the truth waited. And, as Smokey Robinson once suggested, some truths are not denied forever. They're simply delayed until the system no longer needs to hide them. Florence Ballard, the woman stripped of her career and her right to be a mother in public. 1,966. 1,976. Florence Ballard was never meant to vanish. She was not a background extra, not a disposable harmony, not a name meant to be buried in footnotes. She was the original lead singer of the Supremes, the foundation of the group, before fame decided which face the cameras would love most. And yet, by the late 1,960 seconds, Florence Ballard had become one of the clearest examples of what could happen to a woman who no longer matched the image the industry wanted, especially when that woman dared to have a body, a private life, and a desire to be a mother. The breaking point arrived in 1967. Officially, the story fed to the press was simple. Florence was replaced due to internal disputes, missed cues, and unprofessional behavior. That was the version that appeared respectable in headlines. Behind the scenes, however, former Motown employees and musicians would later recount a more ruthless reality. Florence was gaining weight. Her sadness was becoming visible. And, most dangerously in the eyes of the label, there were growing concerns that her personal life, her relationships, her drinking, her potential pregnancies might collide with the Supreme's polished, marketable image. In an era when female pop stars were expected to appear perpetually glamorous, desirable, and conveniently unattached, motherhood was not just discouraged, it was treated as a direct threat to the fantasy. In July 1967, Florence Ballard was removed from the Supremes and replaced by Cindy Birdsong. The move was swift, decisive, and cold. Her name began sliding off future plans, off promotional posters, and off financial structures that continued to generate money from songs she had helped define. Contracts were adjusted, royalties were reduced. The woman who had helped build Motown's most successful female group was suddenly left standing outside a machine that had no interest in protecting her once she stopped fitting its preferred shape. What followed was not liberation, it was collapse. Between 1968 and 1970, Florence gave birth to children during what can only be described as a period of total instability. These births did not come with magazine spreads or congratulations from the industry. They came at a time when she had already lost her primary income, her platform, and her leverage. According to long-circulating rumors within Motown circles, Florence had been under intense pressure not to become pregnant while she was still a Supreme. The unspoken rule was straightforward. Visible motherhood would mark the end of her usefulness. Some insiders later claimed that earlier pregnancies may have existed, pregnancies that were never officially documented, never publicly acknowledged, and never explored in interviews. No medical records were released. No timelines were laid out. Once again, silence stepped in as the preferred solution. As Diana Ross's star burned brighter and brighter, Florence Ballard slipped into the shadows. She attempted to restart her career with a solo deal at ABC Records. But without Motown's powerful infrastructure behind her, she was exposed to the full harshness of the business. Promotion was weak, gigs were scattered, payments were unreliable, songs came and went without the push they needed. All of this unfolded while Florence was trying to care for her children in a life that no longer had a safety net. By the early 1972, Florence's world had entered a dangerous downward spiral. Friends would later describe her as exhausted, wounded, and deeply angry at what had happened. Poverty pressed in from all sides. There are accounts that at times she relied on welfare and assistance just to get by. The same voice that had once filled arenas and fueled million-dollar hits was now singing, when it sang at all, for survival rather than acclaim. Depression settled in. Alcohol became more than a distraction. It became a way to numb a reality that seemed to shrink around her. And the industry that had once celebrated her, dressed her, and photographed her did not step in to save her. No formal support systems appeared. No executive-led intervention materialized. She was treated as a closed chapter, a problem that had been solved the day she was replaced. What makes Florence Ballard's story especially devastating is that her suffering was not hidden. It was visible to the people who had the power to help. Motown executives knew she was struggling. Former colleagues knew she was in trouble. Yet there was no meaningful safety net, no long-term financial arrangement, no public acknowledgement of how much she had contributed and how hard she had fallen. Years later, Smokey Robinson, speaking more broadly about the way women were treated in that era, would offer one of his most haunting reflections. He said that somewhere along the way, they let a great voice believe that becoming a mother was a mistake. He never attached that line to Florence by name. But for those familiar with her history, the reference felt painfully clear. Florence Ballard was not punished because she lacked talent. She was punished because she no longer matched the fantasy. She had a changing body, a complicated life, and children who needed her all things, the system quietly labeled as liabilities. By 1975, Florence's health had deteriorated sharply. Years of emotional trauma, financial stress, and substance use had taken their toll. She was cut off from the music industry, largely invisible to the public, and locked in a daily battle just to keep going. There was no triumphant comeback tour on the horizon, no retrospective celebration, no major label apology. On the 22nd of February 1976, Florence Ballard died at the age of 32. The cause was coronary artery thrombosis. She died without health insurance, in relative obscurity, while the group she helped create continued to earn money and awards. Her passing generated only modest coverage. There was no industry reckoning, no open confession that perhaps something had gone terribly wrong in how she had been treated. Florence Ballard's tragedy was not just the story of one woman's fall. It exposed the structure underneath the glamour. She embodied an unspoken rule that hovered over female artists for years. Success was conditional, and motherhood was acceptable only if it remained invisible, carefully tucked away from the public eye. Once a woman stepped outside that narrow boundary, once she became too outspoken, too unstable, too visibly human, she could be discarded. Unlike Diana Ross, Florence did not have powerful protection. Unlike some of her peers, she did not survive the transition from asset to outsider. Her children grew up without the full recognition of the legacy their mother had earned. Her name was frequently trimmed down or sidelined in simplified histories of the Supremes. Her pain, in the narratives that did survive, was often treated as inconvenient collateral damage. This chapter forces a difficult question. Florence Ballard did almost everything she was asked to do until she couldn't anymore. And when she failed to fit the script, she lost nearly everything: her career, her income, her sense of dignity, and her chance to exist as both an artist and a mother in the public eye. She was not erased by chance. She was erased by design. And as this investigation continues, Florence Ballard stands as one of the most chilling warnings of all of what can happen to women who are no longer useful to the image, but are still very much alive, still suffering, and still unheard. Tina Turner, Children Trapped Inside, A Violent Marriage, 1958. 1978. Long before the world knew Tina Turner as a symbol of survival, reinvention, and raw power, she was a young woman caught inside a relationship that controlled almost everything around her: her money, her music, her body, and her choices as a mother. Audiences saw glittering dresses, tight choreography, and explosive performances that seemed almost superhuman. What they did not see was how early the violence began, or how deeply it shaped every decision she made about bringing children into the world. The story turned sharply in 1958. Tina, then still Anna Mae Bullock, became pregnant while involved with Ike Turner. At that point, Ike was not just a romantic partner circling her life. He was the gatekeeper. He controlled the band, the lineup, the travel schedule, the studio time, and the opportunities Tina believed she needed if she wanted any future in music at all. According to Tina's later testimony, this first pregnancy did not arrive in a moment of joy or security. It arrived inside a growing imbalance: fear on one side, dependence on the other. The child, Craig Raymond Turner, was born in August 1958. From the beginning, Tina was learning a brutal lesson. Becoming a mother would not protect her. It would simply complicate her captivity. By 1960, Tina married Ike Turner. To the public, it looked like the natural next step, the romantic ceiling of a professional partnership that worked perfectly on stage. Privately, that marriage marked the beginning of nearly 2 decades of systematic domestic abuse. Tina would later describe a life where beatings, threats, and psychological warfare became routine, woven into the very fabric of their days. The violence was not limited to fists or words. Ike also exerted control over Tina's reproductive choices. She would eventually reveal that he controlled when she could become pregnant, when she could not, and what would happen if a pregnancy interfered with the band's schedule. Studio time, touring, and bookings were treated as more important than her physical or emotional safety. This is where hard fact and darker rumor intersect. Throughout the 1,960 seconds, insiders spoke in low voices about pregnancies that ended without explanation. Tina herself later confirmed that she had been placed under intense pressure around childbirth, including being coerced into an abortion early in the marriage. In her own accounts, she described this as one of the most traumatic experiences of her life. Something done not for her, but for the show, for the schedule, for Ike's control. There was no public space for this story at the time. The Ike and Tina Turner review had to remain fiery, sexy, and endlessly